Hello, it's Peter Wright and Kathleen Beauvais with another episode of the Yakking Show. This is the show that brings you business ideas and tips that you can take action on to improve your business. We do that by bringing you expert, interesting guests. Today's no exception. But first, let's introduce co-host Kathleen. Hi, Kathleen. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thank you so much. And thank you all so very much for tuning in to our show. We so appreciate you. And as Peter mentioned, we do have another special guest with us today. We have the great privilege of welcoming Craig Andrews to the show. Hello, Craig. How are you?
Very well, Kathleen and Peter. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, fantastic.
Good.
Craig is the founder of the marketing agency Allies4Me with the number 4, Allies4Me. This is a company that uses a proven method of finding strangers and converting them into high-paying customers. So, Craig, on your website, let's just jump in. You mention an 8-stage customer value journey, which is a framework that leads someone from first contact to post-purchase. What exactly is involved in this 8-stage process?
Yeah, so, and let me describe it. I'll describe it in 5 large categories that the different stages fall under. But if you think about courtship, the stages of courtship, you have to start with an introduction. If there's no introduction, there's no courtship. Then after you have that introduction, then you have conversation. And if the conversation goes well, then you have coffee. You know, you don't jump and get married. A few people do.
Yeah.
And you know, and some of those work, and God bless them. But by and large, you don't jump from hello, how do you do to let's get married. You go have coffee. And if coffee goes well, then you move to something a little more intimate. You go out for dinner. And then if that goes well, then you have commitment. And if we were to throw something on afterwards, after commitment, there's something that we like to throw in that we call a delight stage that deals with buyer's remorse. So it's kind of that level. It really does mimic the stages of courtship. And one area where we focus a lot is on what's the kind of the equivalent of the coffee date. So if you think about coffee, you go out on coffee with somebody because you hope it leads to something big and better.
Right.
But you don't know this person. There's risks, there's unknowns. So what happens? You drive to the coffee shop separately. You're taking out the commitment risk. You're taking out all sorts of risk. You meet there separately. Chances are you don't even know each other's address, unless you grew up in a small town like where I grew up and everybody knows everybody. But and if the date doesn't go well, it just kind of ends there. And so we believe that one of the things that's broken in high ticket sales, as a matter of fact, I told you I was scrambling to get off one call to get here. There's somebody who's they're absolutely struggling. Their sales are tanking, and they try to go from hi, how do you do, to will you sign this $1.2 million contract?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And they're struggling, and their business is in a kind of a tough spot. And guess what? Especially in this economy, a lot of people are being cautious. They're not interested in that immediate jump from hello, how do you do, to hey, let's get into this deep.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow, interesting. So I've spent a bit of time on your website over the last couple of days. You've got some really good information on there, and I'd encourage anyone to go and have a look at it. Lots of things I'd like to ask you, but time's limited. One that really struck me was your comments on opinion surveys and focus groups, that they're actually hurting many businesses. And you use an example, I think, of a business was about to destroy many $1 million worth of merchandise because a focus group told them it wasn't going to sell. So tell our audience a little bit more about your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, so that company we're referring to is a little-known company known as Coca-Cola, who back in the 1980s rolled out something called New Coke. And their focus group was 200,000 people.
Wow.
And yeah, massive focus group. 200,000 people led Coca-Cola to make a devastating decision. And it's really interesting. What happened as soon as Coke got rid of what is now known as Classic Coke, and they rolled out the new Coke, people started sending letters to Coca-Cola headquarters. Well, this was before the internet. You couldn't just go on and go to Google, say, what's Coca-Cola's headquarters? You had to go look it up. Then you had to write a physical letter. And then you had to put a stamp on it and walk it down to the post and mail it. And so this was some seriously upset customers. And their focus group didn't lie to them. There's some problems in the way that they structured it, and it's not uncommon. So the article you're referencing also includes an actual video from the focus group that reviewed Apple's iconic 1984 Super Bowl ad. And the focus group failed it. And the Apple board of directors pulled the funding from that, told Steve Jobs that they weren't going to run the ad. And Steve Jobs, of course, being Steve Jobs, he was standing there in front of the board with Wozniak, and he said, "Hey, Woz, I'll pay for half if you'll pay for half." And Woz said, "Sure." And so they bullied their board. They looked at the board and said, "This ad's running. The only question you have to answer is, do you want to be a part of the success that's going to come out of this, or do you want to be known as the person who refused to pay for the ad?" And yeah, not everybody's Steve Jobs. Not everybody can get away with that.
Sure.
But what happens, and there's a deep rabbit hole, but I'll try to keep this very high level. The brain's fascinating. And, you've heard the term left brain, right brain.
Yeah.
If we change it and we think more about system 1 and system 2, system 1 is your fast brain. It's in the back part of your brain. It makes 95% of your decisions. And it does it very, very rapidly. It does it off of a lot of pattern recognition. Your frontal cortex makes about 5% of your decisions. But when you ask somebody why they made the choice they made, it has to explain 100% of the decisions. And the problem is it wasn't always involved in the decision. And there's been some experiments that show what happens is our brains fill in the gaps, makes up nonsense reasons for why we made the choices. And so when you're doing these opinion surveys or focus groups, that's where you end up in this situation like Coca-Cola. They ended up having to scrap $30 million worth of inventory. This was 1984. Wow. So that's like $100 million. This is the type of thing that will get you fired or put your company out of business.
Out of business, sure.
What I don't understand, though, 200,000 people were involved in this focus group, you said.
Right.
How can 200,000 people get it wrong? I find that's astonishing to me.
Yeah. So the question they asked was, which tastes better? The question they should have asked was, which one would you buy? Yeah. If we gave you $1, which one would you buy? And the thing that this is where the brain lies to us, our frontal cortex, in explaining the decision. When they rolled out Coke, there were millions, at least, millions of people who all of a sudden lost the memory of them sitting on the pier with their granddad learning how to fish. So the taste of that classic Coke, which is kind of the essence of branding anyway, is branding creates an emotional response in someone. And so they took away that emotional response that when you drank a Coke, it reminded you of a special event in your life. Wow. And the test subjects, they weren't trying to be deceitful, weren't trying to mislead them. They just, doing these tests is hard. And so here's something else. Here's another example. There was some retail store that ran a special one weekend, and they put somebody at the door of the store to ask people as they walked in, how did you hear about our special? 30% of the people that walked through the door said they heard about the special through the TV ad. The problem is they never ran a TV ad.
They never ran it. Yeah.
And these people weren't lying. They weren't being lazy. They asked the frontal cortex, why did you come here? It was a decision that was made in a different part of the brain. frontal cortex was missing some information. It filled in the gaps, told the person, here's the reason that you answer with. And it was just utter nonsense. And you can see if thankfully they hadn't run TV ads, because otherwise their next special, they may have doubled down on TV ads.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Isn't that amazing? Huh?
So all businesses really have to pay attention to metrics, whether it's your coming in traffic going to your website or whatever, those are important metrics. But are there metrics that you prefer to use, and why?
Yeah. So another really big question. It's probably easier for me to answer the question on the metrics that I try to avoid. And again, I had a workshop with a client this morning, and they were saying, hey, we want to measure this. And we actually have a process we take them through. And we say, okay, once you have the answer to that, what's the action you're going to take afterwards? And they're like, well, I'm going to look at it. I'm like, okay. Well, that metric is just creating noise on your dashboard. It's creating visual noise. It's creating noise that's keeping you from finding the essential truths that you're looking for. And so the metrics that I like are most tied to outcomes. And so now we have one report that we love. It's a very high level report. We call it the pipeline report, and it starts from first touch on the website, or contact wherever the first touch is, all the way through to them being a customer. And it's real simple. And we do because of the sales cycle of our business, we do a rolling 90-day report. And so I can go in there anytime and see, look at how things are going. And the simple answer is manage the red, celebrate the green. So if you see that you're up in areas, okay, don't put your focus there. Then start focusing on what's red and why is it red. And, and that just, so in terms of the metrics, I mean, every business has custom metrics, has custom needs that are unique to them. So it'd be hard. I feel like it'd be irresponsible for me to throw out one metric that's my favorite metric that may work for my business. It may not work for another business. But what I would say, please go ahead.
So sorry, Craig. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but given that, is there any metrics that companies have a tendency to overlook?
I'm surprised by the number of companies that overlook, that fail to tie actions to revenue or measurements to revenue. So people get excited about what their web traffic is. Oh, our web traffic's up, 10% this month. Okay, good. Well, what's that mean to revenue? Well, I don't know. Our web traffic's up 10%. I'm like, who cares if your web traffic's up 10%? So the thing that I see them overlooking predominantly is how it ties to revenue. And so if we start on the other side of the equation and say, well, how much revenue do you want? And we're like, well, I'd like to do 50 million this quarter, or whatever the number is. Okay. And if you're getting that, if you're getting 30% or 50% of that from your web traffic, what does your web traffic need to be to drive that? And so all of a sudden, that's where web traffic has meaning, is more tied back to, if I have this much web traffic, it means this much in revenue. But it's not always correlated. I mean, we made some changes in our business where our web traffic went up double digits, but our sales conversations and our sales went up triple digits.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that is linking the action to the outcome, right?
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems to me, with my age, I was in the corporate world in marketing before the internet and before computers smaller than the size of half of upper floor of the office building. So we didn't have the luxury of all these sort of metrics we're talking about now. We worked things out with paper and programmable calculators. So, but it did mean that because it was such an effort to track metrics, people tended to track the ones that were important and not the ones that were nice to know, right? So
Yeah.
perhaps, and we sort of track things like ad expenditure to sales, direct correlation, and all that sort of thing. Anyway, but we don't want to go back into the past to the pre-internet days, but I just find it interesting that it's so easy to get bogged down with statistics that are not actually helping you in this day and age, right? So
well, wasn't it Mark Twain that said there are lies, damn lies, and statistics?
That's right. It was, yeah. That's attributed to him. You're absolutely right. The one I love, and coming from Texas, cow country and horse country, you'll like this one, that if the computer had been and the internet had been around in the early days of the 19th century, it would have predicted that the rise in population and the amount of commerce in England relying on horse-drawn transport would have meant the whole island would have been 2 feet deep in horse manure in 100 years, right? So I love that statistic. Anyway, Kathleen, I haven't told you that one before. I do apologize. Let's go on to sales conversations, Craig. You teach people how to engineer sort of ideal sales conversations, but with businesses having so many differences, can there be an ideal sales conversation?
Yeah, it's what we call the ideal sales conversation is when somebody comes up to you and says, "May I pay you money to solve this problem for me?" You know, and at which point you just say, "Sure."
Yeah.
And you know, in some ways that's kind of the conversation I was having again immediately before this. It was a call. We actually have a meeting scheduled tomorrow with this prospect, and she called me and said, "I need to understand more of what you do. We have this big problem. I think maybe you can help us solve more. You know, we have more problems than we've discussed, and I want to see if you can help me solve these." Well, that's kind of what I call the ideal sales conversation. Sure. So the big way that we do that is we really focus on the coffee date. Now, for us, we do high ticket sales. We help people with high ticket sales, and the challenge is people get really, really skittish about making a big commitment, and so we just eliminated all that. We took the coffee date concept. We took out the commitment risk. We took out the financial risk. We took out all sorts of risk, and we do a mini project with somebody that we call a first time offer. And there's certain things really critical in structuring those first time offers, but we put those together and we were just wrapping that up. This person got a binder, you know, so when we complete a mini project, we send them a physical binder. We're old school that way, that they get a physical binder with the results and they were flipping through the binder. And that's when they called. And that's a much different scenario than me having to pin them down. Okay, when are we going to talk next? And then trying to figure out how I'm going to sell them. I do this one because I'm horrible at sales. I'm truly not gifted. I'm absolutely horrible at sales. And every time I'd try the different sales scripts, different sales conversations. They left me feeling yucky and they didn't work. And, you know, purely as a matter of survival, the need to put food on the table, I was like, something has to change. And so what we like to say is instead of selling, we just create an environment where people want to buy.
Right. So Craig, there's something on your website that grabbed my attention. You mentioned that, and I'm quoting here, pricing strategies are the battleground where good marketing dies. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so that was from a presentation I was given I gave a number of years ago. What I saw, so when I was in corporate America, especially, and I still see it today, you know, when sales go down. So what's happening? The world economy is not doing great, especially in the high ticket space. Prices are dropping, and or sales are slowing. And so what did people do? They say, okay, we know how to fix this problem. We're going to fix it by reducing the price. And it's funny, I've had people who have actually responded to LinkedIn posts that make that point. who then call me and say, hey, we now have our service at a lower price. I've been offered a opportunity to give you a discount. And it's funny. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm like completely transparent about this. And I told them what the barriers were. And instead of addressing the problem from a marketing perspective, they just try to fight it with price. And the particular challenge is inflation has just gotten really unwieldy lately. And if you're dropping prices while inflation is particularly high, all you're doing is accelerating the rate in which you're imperiling your business.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's a terrible slope to get on because it's so difficult to get off it once you started down that slide, right?
Right. Oh, because the revenue feels good. You made a sale, it feels good, it gives you some endorphins. Then you wake up later with a hangover, realizing, oh, we're not making money on that business. And but so we need to go do more of that. And it's crazy. I mean, I just see it happening all the time. And so what I would say is what you have there is a marketing problem. So funny, again, I'm drawing from conversations I had earlier today. There's a guy named John Spolstra who is a sports marketer. He was the president of the Portland Trailblazers for most of the 80s until Paul Allen took over. And then he ended up doing the marketing for the New Jersey Nets, which was the worst team in the league. They were dead last in the league. And he worked with them for 4 years, and he got them to the point where they were #1 in ticket sales. He took the worst team in the league and beat every other team in ticket sales.
Wow.
And so, what John said that really stuck with me is quit blaming your product for why you're not getting sales. Figure it out. Sell the product you have.
Yeah.
And so that's where. So Kathleen, back to your question, I think that's more of a marketing problem. It's less of a sales discussion. It's more of a marketing problem. What's missing? What's fundamentally missing? Because people don't stop spending money during recessions. My goodness, Walt Disney Corporation was founded during the Great Depression.
It's true.
Yes, and that was just entertainment money.
That's
so
right.
people still spend. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So let's switch gears a bit. Craig, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, because you've got a very interesting background. You call yourself a speaker. You are a speaker and a marketer and a writer, but you say you're always a Marine. So how did you go from serving as a Marine to doing what you're doing now? And there's a subsidiary question to that, because I found out a little earlier from what we were talking about that you learned an awful lot about marketing from a 6-week coma. So there's a couple of questions in one, but do your best with that lot.
All right. Yeah. So in high school, absolutely none of my teachers bragged about me being a model student. I was quite the opposite. And so when I realized my 2.54 GPA would not get me into any university that anybody had ever heard of, I thought, let me try a different route. So I joined the Marine Corps. And if you hang out with Marines, you'll know the worst thing you call somebody as an ex-Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. It was a wonderful, wonderful time of life. I worked with wonderful people and still have friends to this day from my time in the Marine Corps. And when I was in for 6 years, and I was actually stationed in Japan, or deployed to Japan more accurately, right before I got out. And I applied to North Carolina State University from a Japanese post office. I filled out my application. This is before the internet. Actually, the internet was around, but just barely known. And barely. It was still exclusively in the universities. And so I walked down to the post office, applied, came back to the United States, and started university. I thought I wanted to be creative and build things. And I thought, well, engineering would be a great place to do that. And unfortunately, I made it all the way through a master's degree of electrical engineering before I figured out That's not the place to be creative. They do not like creative people there.
No.
It's not how you get rewarded. I did well at my work. I just wasn't happy. And so I thought, well, let me try marketing. And so I marketed semiconductors for mobile phones.
Okay.
Yeah, for about a decade, I did that. And so I was, I've been in the world's largest mobile phone makers, at least back then, back when Nokia was still making mobile phones. Mm-hmm. They sort of are now, but it's, certainly not the days where 1 out of every 2 phones in the world was a Nokia.
Yeah.
Been to Motorola back when they made phones. Ericsson, I actually worked at Ericsson straight out of university, but marketed to Ericsson later. And Samsung, they're the only one, and Apple. So Apple and Samsung were the only 2 that I had visited back in those days that are still in the phone business today. And I traveled to Asia a lot. And, the one thing that, to get those phones to you for a price that you'll buy, there's incredible price pressure on the components. And we had to take 50% of our cost out of our product every single year just to be viable.
Wow.
Yeah. And I knew the days were coming when they would ask me to fly coach to Asia. And I decided early on when that day came, I was like, I'm done. And sure enough, that day came, and I was flying to Asia 4 or 5 times a year. I was like, I'm not flying to coach to Asia 4 or 5 times a year, not doing it. And I've been pretty successful. I mean, I drove over $500 million of revenue in that space. I've been pretty successful. I thought, let me bring my genius to the rest of the world. And I started doing my own marketing. And it's funny, when I run into my buddies from the semiconductor world, they ask me what I've been doing. And I say, I've spent the last decade learning how little I know about marketing. But it's been a neat journey. And so, you asked about my coma. That's a story in itself. But when I woke up, there was a really interesting realization. So kind of the short version is, in August of 2021, I went in the hospital with a severe case of COVID. 11 days later, they shot me full of morphine, which apparently is not good for respiration, which is not something you'd seem to want to hamper with somebody who has a respiration problem. And so a few hours later, they called my wife and said, hey, we're going to put him on the ventilator. And she said, well, he doesn't want to go on the ventilator. And they laughed and they said, well, if he doesn't, he's going to be dead in 24 hours. And she said, well, how many people have you had survive the ventilator? And he said, none have survived. Yeah. So this was the Delta variant of COVID. And the basic rule was, if you went on the ventilator with Delta, you died.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I'm the first one to leave that ICU alive.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And from my understanding, I asked, very, very few followed me. Yeah. But, so they shot me full of morphine. It was lights out for 6 weeks. And something really amazing happened during those 6 weeks. When I woke up 6 weeks later, my trust in the doctors had plummeted, while my trust in my wife had gone through the roof.
Yeah.
And all of this was while I was unconscious. And and when I woke up, my brain was real scrambled. I believed some things about the world that weren't true. And about a week and a half later, I started realizing, okay, I need to get some clarification. So I called my wife over and I said, I'm going to tell you some things. I need you to tell me if these things really happened or not. And the first thing I asked her, I said, have we been to Louisiana? She said, nope, no, we haven't been to Louisiana. She said, why do you ask? And I told her about how I was at a resort in Louisiana convalescing. And, a bunch of weird things happened there, including getting sprayed in the face with raw cow's milk. And which at the time, I believe, this is why I was asking her, did these things happen?
Yeah.
And I said, well, at one point they wanted me to leave the resort and they started getting really angry when I wouldn't leave. And I kept telling them I can't move. And I said, eventually you came in, you put your hand on my left shoulder and you said, Craig, this is Karen. I'm your wife. It's going to be okay. And Karen sat back and she looked at me and she said, Craig, I said that to you while you were in your coma.
Wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
And yeah. Well, there's a Maya Angelou quote that says, people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them
Make
feel.
them feel right.
Yeah.
And during those 6 weeks, while the doctors were speaking death and despair around me, my wife was speaking life, hope, and encouragement. And so when I woke up, the doctors would come and they'd say, hey, we want to do this. And in hindsight, these were immensely normal and reasonable things for them to do. But when the doctors came asking, I always said no. And so they'd have to go to her and convince her. And she'd come to me and she'd say, hey, the doctors want to do this. And I'd ask her, I said, is it safe? She'd say, oh, yeah. And as soon as she said yes, then they could proceed. And so where I would tie that back to marketing, I would actually tie it back to our first time offer. That's like a coffee date.
Mm-hmm.
This is an opportunity for you to go in and give somebody influence how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the conversation I just had immediately before this was so personal, so revealing that I couldn't possibly share it on this podcast. But this person was sharing some immensely vulnerable things about their business with me.
Right.
Well, that's because she trusted me.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And that's why we like these first-time offers, is it creates an environment where you can build that kind of trust without making a big commitment.
Mm-hmm.
After that, the big commitment becomes easy.
Right.
Wow. That is very interesting. And thank you for sharing that for us
Yes,
and our
thank
audience.
you. Absolutely.
I'm
We
watching
are-
the time, Kathleen.
Yes, we are actually.
Shall I go? Shall we? Was there anything quick you wanted to ask, Greg?
Why don't you go on to ask your burning question?
My burning question. So,
Yeah.
and I love being able to ask this of a Marine who's still a Marine, having served in the military myself, but not at the Marine level. I was just an infantryman in the army for part-time in Africa for 10 years, so different experience. But we ask this of all our successful guests, and you're certainly successful in many fields. So, Craig, in your experience, is there one habit, one mindset, or characteristic that sets the successful business leaders apart from those that never really make it, that remain average or just don't get out of the rut? Is it one thing, or is it more complicated?
Well, there's one thing, and it may be complicated. I would say the thing that sets people apart is the ability to look at a situation, see it differently than everybody else,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to see the opportunities. You know, when COVID first hit and the lockdowns first hit, and you know, I saw businesses just, you know, shuttering. It broke my heart.
Yeah.
So much so, I offered a service. I said, if you pay me $25, I'll give you a 30-minute COVID consultation to figure out how to get your business going again. You know, we always charge something. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's some psychology behind that.
Sure.
Mhm.
And you know, we had a fella take me up on that, and he said, "Well, I coach public speakers." Well, there's no public speaking. My business is shot. And we sat down and we started mapping out what he had, and he had a client that was going to give a commencement address at a university at his alma mater. And by looking at the problem differently, I said, you know, Jim, your client, nobody cares about the commencement address. You know, that's just somebody has to talk until they get to leave. I said, COVID's just flipped that for you. You have all these students who have their degrees and they're about to graduate and they have student debt and they're looking for jobs, but they can't go out and interview for jobs. Your client is a successful business owner who knows what he's looking for in employees and applicants. I said, he's more valuable not only to the students, but he's also more valuable to the university than he was before COVID.
Absolutely.
I said, you need to go ahead with this commencement address, just move it online and have the focus of it be how to find a job in COVID.
Right. Right. Well,
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, very good. Very good answer. Thank you.
so Craig,
For that.
final question for you. How do people contact you?
Yeah, so our website is allies4me.com. That's the number 4. And we actually have a gift for your audience. So we talked a little bit about first-time offers.
Thank you.
When I first set out to do those, my first one failed. My second one failed. My third one failed a little bit less. It took me like 18 months to get this figured out, well, to start getting it figured out. And then we've been refining it over the last 5 years. Well, we've made a guide to help you avoid some of the mistakes that we've made. And so that's one thing we're offering. We also have a self-paced course where you get 23 days access to the course. The reason we're limiting it to 23 days is, like you, I've signed up for free courses that I've never logged in to use. We want to see this change your life. So you get 23 days access, and we actually see it in the analytics. So the way you access that is just go to allies4me.com/yakking, all one word, all lowercase, and you'll get that.
Wonderful.
Very good. Thanks for that, Craig. We will put that in. And for our audio listeners, you can get all those details in the description on whatever platform you're listening to this on. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
Yes, it was a privilege again. And thank you also very much for tuning in. If anyone is interested in being a guest on our show, please visit us at theyakkingshow.com. All you need to do is click on the contacts tab where you will find a short application form, and we'd love to hear from you. And if there's any topics that are of interest to you, please let us know. We have access to wonderful experts on this show. Until next time, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.